Back in the day when you went from one console generation to the next one, the games you'd get on the new generation of hardware would be a big step up from the games you'd get from the prior generation of hardware. It was almost a night and day difference, and you would get a bunch of new franchises that you had never seen before. And if you're going to get games from existing franchises, the games you would get would be a huge step up from the older games. Take the leap between the 6th generation of consoles to the 7th. Video games finally went from standard definition to high definition. Graphics were undeniably much better on the 7th generation of consoles compared to the 6th, and yet you still got a bunch of new IPs like Assassin's Creed, Mass Effect, or Uncharted, and games like GTA 4 and 5 and games like Oblivion and Skyrim represented big evolutions for other franchises. The 7th generation was a really good example of what a generational leap could be, but that was then, and this is now. The 9th generation of consoles in a lot of ways feels completely different of the 7th generation and the generations before that. This generation we've only seen a few true 9th gen exclusives, and a good amount of those exclusives are remakes. Demon's Souls and The Last of Us Part 1 have gorgeous graphics, but they're PS3 games at their core. Those aren't truly next gen games. In terms of new games that are actually next gen and that aren't just remasters or remakes, we've only gotten a handful of games like Alan Wake 2 or Baldur's Gate 3 or Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. A big reason for this is of course the large amount of cross-gen games. Games like God of War Ragnarok, Gran Turismo 7, and Horizon Forbidden West all received PS4 versions. And while Sony might be lacking in terms of releasing next-gen exclusive games, Microsoft is doing a little bit better, but still not great. Hi-Fi Rush was successful, but Hi-Fi Rush is also a smaller scale game, and it's now getting ported over to PS5. Redfall was panned by basically everyone. Starfield ended up getting a pretty mixed reception, but in 2024, Xbox is getting a new Hellblade game and a new Indiana Jones game. But I wouldn't say Xbox is doing a great job of releasing new next-gen Xbox games either. It just feels like of this generation, there haven't been that many games that have really tapped into the power of these consoles. There just haven't been many games that have been next-gen. But next-gen is a term that gets thrown around. What does it actually mean? What does it even mean to make something next-gen? I suppose the answer can vary from person to person, but to me, next-gen is something that couldn't run on previous generations of hardware without massive compromises. Like Red Dead Redemption 2 could never run on a PS3 or Xbox 360. There's no way those consoles can run Red Dead Redemption 2 with a similar level of fidelity and scope. That's a game that needed the power of the PS4 and Xbox One to run, and Red Dead Redemption 2 is definitely a game that pushed those consoles to the limit. Of course, this line does get a bit blurry. Cyberpunk 2077 did come out on the PS4 and Xbox One, but based on what I've seen online, those versions of the game seem pretty lackluster, especially on the base consoles, so I'm not sure it's even fair to call Cyberpunk 2077 a cross-gen game. While there haven't been that many games that have been exclusive to this generation of consoles, we've gotten a couple of games that do fulfill that requirement. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Returnal, Forspoken, these are all 9th gen exclusive games, but that's where we get into another issue. The games that do take advantage of the power of these consoles, and the games that do feel next gen, also feel very familiar to games they've already gotten. Games like Spider-Man 2 look amazing and they definitely feel next gen when it comes to stuff like loading times, but Spider-Man 2 isn't radically different from the original Spider-Man game on PS4, it's just more Spider-Man. This isn't of course a bad thing, but think back to what I said about the 7th generation, where we would get games that were unlike anything we saw from the 6th generation. It just isn't the same anymore. But why? Well, I think one reason is diminishing returns, which is becoming a bigger and bigger problem with every console generation. Going from the PS1 to the PS2 is obviously going to be a more noticeable leap than going from PS4 to PS5. Look at this footage I captured from a Metal Gear Solid Master Collection. Look at Metal Gear Solid 1 versus 2. There's a huge difference between Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2. It's night and day. You instantly notice of a difference as soon as you see the footage between the two games. You instantly know which game is the more advanced title. Even if you're not a gamer, you can easily tell that Metal Gear Solid 2 is the more advanced game compared to 1. Now look at Final Fantasy 15 versus 16. 16. 16 definitely looks better than 15, but the difference isn't night and day between these two games. It's more subtle improvements that aren't that noticeable if you aren't comparing them side by side to each other. Because the reality is, the more advanced graphics get, the more you reach a point of diminishing returns, where differences aren't as immediately apparent. But of course, the issue of diminishing returns applies to more than just graphics. It applies to scope, gameplay length, and just gameplay in general. With every generation, games have gotten bigger and bigger, and it's gotten to a point where the increase in scope just isn't that impressive anymore. Big open world games were super exciting during the 7th generation of consoles, but they no longer feel revolutionary, and instead it just sort of feels like the norm. It feels like almost every AAA game has some sort of world to explore, and I think it's gotten to a point where there are a good amount of people who have gotten sick of open world games, and who just prefer games to be more linear. Games have gotten longer too. According to How Long to Beat, on average, it takes 9 hours to complete the original God of War's main story. Of course, this is on PS2. Fast forward 17 years, and let's look at God of War Ragnarok. It takes 26.5 hours to complete God of War Ragnarok's main story. There was a time where it felt like a game being longer was a selling point, but it definitely doesn't feel that way anymore. I've seen a lot of people say online that they want games to be shorter, and that's the thing, because a big portion of next-gen game leaps we would see in the past were due to games becoming bigger and offering more content, but it's no longer revolutionary and cutting edge to make your game bigger and longer. Starfield is Bethesda's biggest game, and yet I've seen almost no one praise the game for how big it is. If anything, I've seen almost the opposite. Many people have criticized Starfield for being a game that's big but barren. Starfield has 1,000 planets, but yet these planets all feel pretty bland and uninteresting. Instead of having a game with 1,000 planets where most of the planets feel pretty dull, the game would have benefited from having a smaller scope, where planets would have been more diverse and unique. Bigger does not mean better, and I think Starfield's a really good example of this. And this kind of feeds into another point. At this point, it's just a lot harder for developers to make the next-gen leaps the way that they used to. Games today cost a lot more to make than they used to. According to reports, documents, and leaks I've read online, God of War Ragnarok reportedly cost around $200 million to make, Horizon Forbidden West cost $212 million, The Last of Us Part 2 cost $220 million, and Spider-Man 2 cost $315 million to make. Compare this to God of War 3, which had a budget of $44 million, and the original Horizon Zero Dawn, which cost less than $50 million to make, and Spider-Man 2018, which only had a budget of around $90 million. Obviously, inflation and COVID are big factors as to why games have gotten more expensive, but even factoring those into the equation, it's clear that games are just much more expensive to make now. It's no longer possible for a game to only sell a few million copies like the old days. Games with budgets in the hundreds of millions need to become smash hits, and with stakes this high, of course it's going to be very hard for developers to go and innovate like they used to. They can't afford to make games of weird or off-the-wall ideas like they could in the past. Games need to appeal to as many people as possible in order to sell well, and I think that's why the AAA gaming space has become so homogenized. So many games nowadays feel almost like clones of each other. Maybe they have some different mechanics or a different world or a different set of characters, but it feels like so many games nowadays have to have some type of open world or some form of exploration. They need to have some type of RPG mechanics, and they need to have some type of crafting system. And I think it's because games have to get bigger, they have to look better, they have to step it up, they have to be next gen. Just because a game is next gen doesn't mean it's gonna be a better and more interesting game. Going back to what I said earlier about how next gen to me at least felt like a game that couldn't run on the previous generation of hardware, making a game that really takes advantage of the current consoles can in a way be a limitation on the games themselves. Now that hardware is at a certain level, a game has to reach a certain level of fidelity or scale in order to feel next gen. Otherwise, it fails to feel next gen, and it may feel like a lesser game than it actually is in the eyes of some gamers. Take God of War 2018 for example. God of War 2018 was a game that did push the PS4 hardware to its limits. All these things are pretty impressive for the PS4. The sequel God of War Ragnarok was a cross-gen game that was obviously a PS4 game at its core, and despite being pretty well received overall, one criticism I did see for the game was that it didn't feel next gen. It didn't fully utilize the PS5 hardware. The game visually looked like what you would see on the PS4. The gameplay and set pieces were all reminiscent of what you saw on PS4, and had a lot of the same limitations that the 2018 God of War game had on PS4. God of War 2018 had this wow factor to it, which I think is a big reason as to why it won Game of the Year. But the wow factor for Ragnarok wasn't there for a lot of people because they'd already done this before, especially on PS5 when you're still playing what's basically a PS4 game. But that's part of what makes God of War Ragnarok interesting for me. I'm currently playing through God of War Ragnarok right now, and I think the game looks incredible. And I think the game looks a lot better than most other games out on the market right now. And that includes a lot of 9th gen exclusive games. Because it's a PS4 game at its core, the game's able to run at 60 frames per second without making big sacrifices to graphical quality, which is something that you can't say about a lot of current gen exclusive games. And because of the game's amazing art direction, the game still looks incredible. It makes up for the fact that the game is a PS4 game. God of War Ragnarok is just a very polished game that, in spite of its PS4 limitations, has pretty fantastic gameplay, a story that I feel is still super gripping, and some really impressive moments that I think are just incredible. It doesn't matter to me that it isn't taking advantage of the PS5 because at the end of the day, it's just a great game, which is really all I want when it's all said and done. And the thing too is that while a lot of the limitations that games have had of graphics and gameplay due to hardware have been removed, limitations can often make for better and more interesting games. Think about Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII is a game with graphics that by today's standards are pretty outdated. Characters look super blocky, and they sort of resemble Lego minifigures. When you're in the overworld map, Cloud looks like the size of an entire village. Obviously the visuals are pretty limited, but this actually helped the game in a way, because now the developers were able to create a story that spanned the entire planet. You visit so many places in Final Fantasy VII, and there was so much content and variety to the game. Now Final Fantasy VII is being remade for modern consoles, and developers are now able to make these characters far more realistic and lifelike. And yet that's a limitation because you can't make a game with the scope of Final Fantasy VII with the fidelity you expect from a modern day game within a feasible time frame and budget without making big cuts. To make Final Fantasy VII again for modern times, they now have to split the same game up into multiple parts, and I think that's pretty interesting. A game that was made almost 30 years ago in 90s hardware can't be made again as one game. Think also about unique games like Parasite Eve, or Vagrant Story, or Xenogears. These all came from the same company and all came out from 1998 to 2000. And while they were all RPGs, they all had differences that made each of them have their own identity. Hardware limitations sound like a bad thing for a game, a thing that holds games back, but the reality is those same limitations can actually be the very thing that gives freedom to a lot of developers. They can allow developers to take chances and make games that might be weird or unique. They can also allow us gamers to get new types of experiences from games that we would never get before. And isn't that what we want from games? To get new experiences that immerse us and that resonate with us? Getting those experiences though doesn't require the games to push technical boundaries. In fact, some of the most critically acclaimed games that came out on the PS4 and Xbox One last gen weren't really pushing those consoles to their limits. Persona 5, Hollow Knight, Nier Automata, Metal Gear Solid 5, all of these games were either on 7th gen consoles or could probably run on those consoles with some optimization. Despite the Nintendo Switch being an underpowered console, it managed to get games like Super Mario Odyssey, The Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom, and Metroid Dread, games that were all very well received. I'm not saying the Nintendo Switch isn't outdated, I think it is, and I do think it's time for a next gen Switch, but I think this Switch shows that it's possible to create compelling games that aren't pushing technical boundaries. Switch games won't blow your mind the way that a game like Horizon Forbidden West will, but man does the Switch have some really incredible games. And if you want to talk about incredible games, I think indie games are a great showcase of what could be achieved with smaller budgets and not having to try and reach a certain technical level. While AAA games have become stagnant and lacking in innovation, the exact opposite is happening in the indie space. In the indie space, we're getting so many innovative games and so many different type of games. Games that really do give gamers something new and exciting. Games like Outer Wilds, Stardew Valley, and Hades offer players some really incredible gameplay experiences. These games would never be viewed as next-gen powerhouses. They don't push the power of the consoles they run on, and yet these games have had a huge impact on the gaming community. And I'd argue that these games have stayed with gamers far longer than most modern-day AAA games. And not only were they cheaper to make, but they were also much cheaper to buy, which only benefited consumers. Most studios outside the Sony first-party studios, and studios like Rockstar and CD Projekt Red, don't have the budget and resources to make cutting-edge looking games, but they don't have to in order to make incredible games. I keep hearing people say that these consoles haven't been pushed to their limits yet, but I pose the question, should they be? Should they be pushed if it means games are going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars to make? Should they be pushed if it means that we're going to get the same 3 to 4 types of games? Should they be pushed if it means we're only going to be getting a handful of titles in a generation? I mean, look at the output of a studio like Naughty Dog. During the 7th generation, they were able to put out 2 new IPs and 4 games in total. During the 8th generation, depending on how you view The Lost Legacy, Naughty Dog put out 2 2 to 3 new games, all of which are part of franchises that already existed. During the 9th generation, all we've gotten from Naughty Dog was a remake of the first Last of Us, a remaster of the second Last of Us, and the Last of Us multiplayer game that actually didn't even come out because it was cancelled. So many big studios and companies have had massive layoffs. Even Insomniac, which put out Spider-Man 2, a game that already sold 10 million units despite having only released in October, even they're having layoffs. It just isn't a sustainable way to make games anymore. Not every game has to push the PS5 and Series X to its limits. It's okay to make smaller games that aren't as graphically intensive. And personally, I think the idea of the console generation is becoming more and more outdated with each generation. With games taking longer and longer to make and games becoming more and more scalable, I think in the future, games no longer need to be defined by the consoles they run on, and that's okay. Hardware and games have evolved to a point where I think it's alright for the idea of the console generation to go away. Console hardware has already become more and more incremental with the release of mid-gen consoles like the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X. And I want to say one last thing, this video might make it seem like I don't want any games to have incredibly realistic looking graphics, or that I think there's no point in new hardware, and that's not true. I'm totally happy with games existing that do push consoles and that are next gen. I just don't think that these should be the only type of games that big studios go out and make. I think it's okay to go back and make smaller scale titles that aren't as technically impressive. Not every game needs to be the next GTA 6. And I do think the PS5 and Xbox Series X have benefits outside of just running more demanding games. These new consoles have SSDs which lets games load in way faster. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart uses the PS5's SSD in really cool ways, like letting you go from world to world seamlessly. To me, this is a clear showcase of what next gen can be, and Ratchet & Clank only cost $81 million to make, which isn't small, but it's also a lot less than some of the other games I've mentioned. It's also really nice to see a lot of games now run at 60 frames per second, while also targeting higher resolutions. This is something you didn't really get much of back on the PS4 and Xbox One, and I think it's stuff like this that give these new consoles more value. Also, the DualSense controller is such an incredible piece of technology that has the potential for a lot of really cool and unique gameplay situations. Like, I played the game Astro's Playroom back in the early days of owning a PS5, and I loved all the ways it utilizes the DualSense's features, the way it used the DualSense's haptic feedback, and subtle vibrations. It was all just so good. I think if the PS5's unique capabilities are going to be utilized, I think utilizing the DualSense's controller is the way to do it without having to make games that cost a fortune. But those are only my thoughts. All of my thoughts that I've given in this video are just from my opinion. I'm not saying in any way that I'm right or that anyone who thinks differently from me is wrong. I think this topic of next gen is definitely something that'll have a lot of varied opinions, but let me know what you think. Comment below and let me know, and if you enjoyed the video, liking and subscribing would really help me out. But that's all from me. Thanks so much for watching, and stay awesome.